Hello everybody, this is my comprehensive review of the Bosch GCM 12 Axial-Glide Mitre Saw. Some of its features, its usability, what I like about it and what I don't like about it as well. Let's get going. So I'm not going to bore you with the specs on all this because at the end of the day that's something you can just read, but as a brief overview, massive 12-inch blade on here, huge 2 kilowatt motor. It can cut panels that are 341 millimeters wide and 104 millimeters deep. It can bevel 45 degrees to the left, 45 degrees to the right with a 2-degree undercut on both of those edges, 60 degrees to the right on the mitre and 52 degrees to the left on the mitre here. Now perhaps one of the most striking and functional features about this saw is the articulated arm at the back. It has a incredibly smooth action on it and is ideal for a workshop because on other mitre saws they usually run on bars. If you wanted a saw with this amount of capacity front to back in here, the bars need to be able to accommodate that. And having those bars there usually means you have to have about 5 or 6 inches of dead space behind the saw just to allow clearance for them to slide back. With this, that flat section there, straight up against the wall, no space is wasted whatsoever, and you still get the benefit of this massive depth of cut. But saying that, I think this saw is more geared towards use in a workshop because that arm on the back adds a lot of weight to this thing. Lugging this around is no easy task whatsoever. This arm is great for saving space, whereas if you were lugging this around on site and things like that, do you actually need it to save that space? Because you could just move this on its mitre saw stand to any corner of the room or wherever you're working. You don't necessarily need to save that space behind, whereas if you're in a small workshop like I am, every little bit of space helps. And having it plonked in one place and not moving around at all is very beneficial considering the weight. It's not to say you couldn't use it on site, but just be aware that it's pretty weighty. So one of the first things that I really like about this saw is the handle on it. It's massive. When you use it, everything is exactly where you'd expect it to be. The guard release, press that in with your thumb and that allows it to slide back as you plunge it down. The trigger is absolutely massive, so you can press it at any point along this handle. And then what you might be able to see on the top here is you have the switch for the laser exactly where your index finger is as well. So everything is exactly where you need it to be. All the adjustments are in red, so it's easy to see the points that you need to engage with on here. And yeah, a good handle is one of those things that you appreciate when you actually use one with a bad handle, because the Festool Capex or Capex, whatever you want to call it, the handle on that is more of like a pistol grip thing, so it's right up here, and it's something that I saw Mark Spagnolo also state in his review, because it's kind of, you got to reach right over the top to get the trigger release to go, and then you plunge it down. It's quite nice when you're down here, but when it's up there, it's a lot of stress on this bit of your arm and it's just not very nice. Something like this, very easy to use, and if you bevel this to the left and you want to use your left hand for it, you can press it in with your little finger as well and still engage the saw very easily. So next let's look at some of the adjustments on here. So what's great about this saw is pretty much all of the adjustments bar a few are at the front here. So this one unlocks the bevel at the back, so that will allow it to tilt left and right, and these ones here all control the mitre. So first thing you can do is loosen the locking knob here, and it's still not going to move at this point because at the moment this is engaged in an indent underneath the saw so that it can get back to 0 degrees quickly and easily. To get it out of that indent, you lift up the trigger underneath, and that's going to allow you to swivel it left and right. And so as you turn it along the front here on all the common angles, there is a little trapezoidal shape which indicates all of the indents that the saw automatically locks into. Now sometimes you'll take it to an indent and you want it to be not quite in that but just next to it, but when you get it nearby it kind of slips back into it. So to disengage that, that's what this button here does. So lift up the trigger, press that in, and now that isn't going to lock in any of the indents whatsoever, and you can really dial in the final angle you want in here. So just lock it down like that and it ain't going to go anywhere. So the mitering on here, absolutely love it, can't really fault it whatsoever. Now we'll move on to the beveling. So to release the bevel, got this massive lever here. Lift that up, and now that will allow us to tilt the head to the left. Now what I quite like about this compared to other saws is that there's enough friction in that head to kind of hold it in place and allow you to kind of tap it into the final position you want, whereas on some other saws you're kind of having to wrestle with the weight of the head to kind of line it up with the scale you want at the back and then lock it down, and it's just difficult to try and get the placement you want, whereas this, you've got enough friction there that it's just going to kind of hold itself in place. Even tilted all the way over to 44 degrees, there's still enough friction in there to hold it in place and stop it slipping any further. So in terms of getting this saw back to 0, when it's tilted left, you simply press it up and it's going to hit 0 like that. If you want to tilt it to the right, you've got this little knob here. So you press that clockwise and then it's going to allow you to press the saw to the right. And if we move this fence back, that's going to allow it to go all the way to 45 degrees. And if you want that 47-degree undercut, tilt it the other way, just take the weight off the head of the saw, and then it's going to allow it to go a little bit further. You'll see now as we lift it up, locks back into 0, and then there we go, back at 0 degrees. So you might have noticed the little knob at the back here. So what that does is as you pull it out, rotate it, a spring's going to pull it back into that mechanism, and as you slide it up, it's going to engage in 22.5 degrees, which is a quarter of 90 degrees. And although I haven't needed it, it could be useful here and there. You've also got a marking there for 33.9, which is useful for some compound cuts, as well as 30 degrees, again, compound cuts. And also with this locking knob, it can be a little bit fiddly to try and get out sometimes. You've got to sort of wiggle the head a bit while pulling it, and yeah, it can just be a little bit frustrating sometimes. Now, although I said there's a nice amount of friction when you tilt this head, it kind of holds itself in place. My actual problem with this is actually with the locking mechanism, which is here. So I'll press that down, and it's pretty stiff, to be honest. It's not the easiest thing to engage and disengage. You see, with the saw not being bolted down, it actually lifts up the entire saw. You have to press it down and then lift up the handle to disengage it. But despite how much pressure you put down on this locking lever here, I still find that if you try and twist the head from left to right, you can still get a little bit of play in the bevel at the back. Now, this is only a problem if you abuse your saw. If you're using it as you should and pulling it straight and not giving it any sort of shunts from left to right, you're not going to have this problem whatsoever. But for me, considering the locking is that stiff on it, I would expect it to be completely grounded on the bevel here, because on the other GCM 12 without the glide arm on the back, the locking is on the back here where the bevel scale is. Very easy to use, and the locking on it is absolutely solid. It almost doesn't really feel like you're even locking it down on the other saw, whereas on this one, when you lock it down, you think, oh yeah, it's just doing something. It locks down and there's still a bit of play. But again, like I say, it's only if you're actually abusing this saw, if you're whacking it from the side and things like that. It does take quite a lot of force to get it to move half a degree left and right. Now, saying that, you can tighten the locking mechanism on this saw by slightly tightening this bolt here. But again, by the time I tightened it enough that there was zero play in it whatsoever, once I'd locked it down, releasing and tightening that lock was just far too much effort. In fact, it made the machine start creaking. There was far too much tension on it. So while the bevel locking on this is perfectly fine, it would be nice to see it updated to something similar to the GCM 12, the model below this, with that easier locking on there, because it's easier to use and the locking is a lot stronger, whereas on this, it's harder to use and the locking isn't as good. Just needs a bit of updating. Now, getting this saw so it resets back at 0 is incredibly easy. What you've got on the back here is an Allen key that you can simply remove, and along the mitre scale you've got 4 of these little holes here, with each of them having an Allen bolt on the bottom, which you simply loosen, and then with a square pressed against the fence and the blade plunged down with the machine off, obviously, you can get it so these mitre indents down the bottom here are spot on 90 degrees when you lock it back at 0, and then when you go to 45, it's going to be spot on there as well. And as for setting the bevel back to 0, you've got 2 bolts here that you need to undo, and the 0 degree stop can be adjusted on an Allen screw here, and the 45 degree stops for the bevel can be adjusted through 2 bolts that are in the back of the head as well. But showing you how to adjust the mitre and the bevel and things like that isn't something I'm going to show you in this video, because Brian at Garage Woodworks has already done an incredible video on this by using a micrometer. He references it off the fence to get it perfectly square, and then references it off the bed to get it perfectly 45 degrees and 90 degrees. It looks to be incredibly accurate, and once I get my hands on a micrometer, I'm going to try it myself, because it just leaves no margin for error whatsoever on this, and once it's locked down, you shouldn't have to do it again. So in terms of bed flatness on here, it's looking pretty good. The insert plate is about 0.5 millimeter below the bed on here, which isn't ideal. It would be nice to have that perfectly flush, because I don't really see a reason why that is lower. But the main cutting area that surrounds that insert plate is perfectly flat, so no concerns there whatsoever. You also have built-in extensions on this saw, which is amazing, because this is an add-on on a lot of other saws. Looks to be low now, but as soon as you lock it in place, brings it to be perfectly level with the rest of that bed. So yeah, that's a really, really great feature. But going back to that insert plate, if you did want it to be perfectly flush with the top of the bed, you could very easily make your own. It's just 6 holes drilled in the correct place. And also, you'll notice the gap down the middle on here is quite big. If you wanted to make that a little bit smaller, or even a 0 clearance, the Allen key that's supplied, you can loosen all of these by 1/4 of a turn, and they can slide in and out like that to give you a zero clearance. So you'll cut through it and you can use that as a sacrificial base, but the fact it isn't butted up right against the timber, it's not going to be absolutely brilliant for it. I'd recommend making a sacrificial insert for here. And now we'll move on to blade change, which again is something that's not too difficult with the saw, but I feel like it could be updated. So let me just unplug it. Okay. Yep, we're all good. So blade change on the model below this, the GCM 12 that I mentioned earlier, very easy. It's got a quick release on it. So you literally just lift the guard out of the way, press in an arbor lock, and then you can unlock it with an Allen key. Taking off the blade would take about 10 seconds. On this one, it's a little bit more difficult. Firstly, you need to loosen the one down here by a few turns. Then you've got 2 Allen screws up here, one of which you need to pretty much completely take out. The nice thing about this is it's captive in there, so by the time you fully release it, it's not going to fall out. And this other one, a few turns just to loosen it a bit. Now we'll take this one fully out, and that's what's going to allow you to move this guard up. So then you need to press in the guard release and push that out of the way. And this is quite fiddly, but it is possible to reach this far enough back to loop a little hole in here over that captive nut that we unscrewed earlier. So there we go, that's going to hold the blade out of the way. You've then got an arbor lock on the back, which you press in, and as you're spinning the blade by hand, it's going to lock in. And then at this point, I find it easier to lock the head in place so that it can't slide forwards and backwards anymore. And then while you're pressing that arbor lock in, you can loosen the nut on the side of the blade. Just be aware that it's a left-hand thread. So instead of righty-tighty, it's righty-loosey. Take that all the way out, and then your blade is going to be able to come out like that. And while I've got this blade out, it's worth saying that this blade is made by Freud, which make exceptional quality router bits, cutting tools such as this, really top of the range stuff. So when you get this saw, don't feel the need to replace this immediately. You've got a very good quality saw blade in here that's supplied as standard with it. And so to get it back in, straight up like that, making sure you've got it round the correct way. Obviously, you don't want the teeth cut in the opposite way. Big washer thingy goes on, bolt goes over that, making sure that you're now turning it anti-clockwise to tighten it up. So arbor lock in place, and then Allen key to tighten it. And to get the guard down, take it off this, swing the guard back down, and then you've just got to start tightening everything back up. So to start with, I like to lock this one down first, not all the way, just enough to kind of hold this arm in place, and then it's easy enough to tighten all these ones down afterwards. If you tighten these ones first, it's a bit troublesome to try and get that one back into place. So lock those both down, not too much pressure, and then tighten this one off. Now after all that, I think it's about time for a test cut. So I've got a nice thick bit of ash here, which we're going to see what the quality of the cut's like, how accurate it is, and yeah, just give you a basic idea of what it's like in use. And we're going to be pairing this up with a Bosch extractor. So you see that we're very close to maximising out this saw as it is. This board is massive, but we still haven't quite got the full capacity of the saw. The reach on this is absolutely incredible. So you also get supplied a clamp with the saw as well, which is an improvement upon the ones that I've seen in the reviews from the US and things like that. This one kind of has a quick release feature on it, which is something that they lacked previously. You just had to control the entire clamping motion on this one thread here. So if you had to clamp something that was 3 inches thick, you'd eventually tighten it up to that. And then if you had to clamp something that was 10 millimeters or half an inch thick, you'd have to go through the laborious process of tightening that down all the way to the bottom. So having the quick release on here gives you a quick adjustment up and down of about 2 inches. So we'll move that on there and then do the final tightening. And as I said at the start of this video, you also have a laser which is also fully adjustable. It's a little bit more fiddly to do, and Bosch recommends sending it back to them to do, but it is possible to adjust yourself to make sure it's exactly the same width as the curve of the blade and make sure it's straight and all that. But anyway, I'm going to stop chatting. Let's do a cut. So what we've been left with is a beautifully smooth cut, and best of all, the laser line is right on the edge of this material just before it drops off where the curve of the saw started to cut. So yeah, no complaints about that at all. So before checking how square this cut is, it's worth saying a few words about the dust extraction on this machine, because mitre saws are obviously not known for being the most efficient machines at collecting dust. It just tends to spray all over the wall and then back in your face and things like that. So they're not usually that great, but this has done particularly well. I made sure the machine was spotless before making a cut, and there's not a whole lot of dust that's been left over, especially from such a wide cut like this. Looks like most of it went up the extraction chute. However, compared to the Festool Capex or Capex, I never never actually know how you say it. The Festool Mitre Saw. The dust collection on this isn't quite as good as the Festool, but it's still very, very good compared to a lot of other mitre saws I've seen. But I would always recommend you link it up to an extractor, because this is supplied with a bag. Where did I put it? It's supplied with a bag that you can just hook over here, but there's no suction coming from that whatsoever. It doesn't really do a whole lot. It collects a little bit of the dust, but it's always worth connecting it up to an extractor. So let's check how square this cut is. Okay, I'll clamp that and we'll get the Bridge City square that I did a review for recently. This thing is accurate to 0.05 of a millimetre. So if this says it's square, then I know I can trust it. Look at that, spot on. You can actually hear it rubbing along its entire length. So yeah, absolutely no complaints about that whatsoever. Lovely clean cut, perfectly square. You can't really ask a lot more from that. So what would I give this mitre saw out of 10? It would have to be a solid 8.5 or 9 or something like that, because this saw is absolutely amazing. It's so easy to use. It's got plenty of power behind it. The cut's really clean, the cut's really accurate. The only small niggles I have about this is the fact that the GCM 12 without the Axial-Glide on the back, so otherwise exactly the same machine, has some better specs than this one, which includes the locking and the bevel on the back, the fact that it's able to lock easier on there, yet the lock's even stronger, and also the fact that you can change the blade very quickly and easily on the other model, whereas on this one, it's a little bit more fiddly. So I think this needs updating in a few of those aspects, but to be fair, how often do you change a blade on a mitre saw? Not very often. So that's me just kind of looking for something to complain about. And the bevel locking, unless you're whacking this from side to left, I was about to say side to left then, from left to right, unless you're whacking it from left and right, you're really not going to notice those problems with the bevel locking. And obviously dust extraction as well, I feel like could be improved by just making a slightly bigger shroud on here. This is something that Dan Patterson did in another video, which I'll link in the top corner. He made a larger shroud for the back where there's actually templates that you can download to make your own, and it made such a difference. So a link to his video is in the top corner as well as in the description. Definitely go and watch that if you're interested in this saw. But otherwise, I would thoroughly recommend this saw to everyone else. If you're in a workshop, you're going to love that glide arm. If you're on a site, you're probably not going to need it. Get the GCM 12. And if you're in the market for an 8-inch blade, a 10-inch blade mitre saw, have a look at some of the other saws in the Bosch range, because in my opinion, they are miles ahead of your things like Makitas and DeWalt's and things like that. Bosch ones are just nicer to use in my opinion. They've got better build quality and they just work exactly as intended. So definitely have a look at the Bosch range. Ignore all of your brand loyalties, and yeah, not much else to say on that. See you in the next video.